Welcome to the Spring Hills Podcast, Year in the Word edition. As a church, we're reading through the entire Bible in 2025. Each episode of the Year in the Word podcast, our pastors will unpack the daily reading, explore its meaning, and help us live it out. So grab your Bible, lean in, and let's grow together.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the Year in the Word podcast. This is podcast episode 5, and we've got some good passages today. I'm with my friend Vaughn. Vaughn is part of our 1825 crew.
Yep.
You're also on staff here part-time. Man, really good to be with you today, and really easy passage that we're going through, right?
Yeah, totally.
Vaughn?
It wasn't throwing me through a loop at all when I first started. No.
So Numbers 16 through 18 is kind of what we looked at today. Really, the end of Numbers 16 was the daily reading, but we should go back a little bit and talk about number 16 in general.
Back and reread
Yep.
it again, yeah.
So as you go through, which would have been yesterday's reading, right? And as you go through yesterday's reading, the tail end of it, what do you see? Like what observations, what things stood out to you?
Well, I think the first thing that stood out to me is kind of the correlation between this and the passage you taught on a few weeks ago, which is the golden calf. And it's this like first showing that I'm seeing as a young Christian going through the Old Testament of God's wrath and his response to, him having this jealousy for us. And it's been a hard thing for me to comprehend is just how much sort of death I'm seeing. I think it's something that like kind of took me off guard as to like where that wrath is coming from in comparison to, the New Testament, which is what I started reading.
Yeah, and for those of people that aren't, you don't know you as well, you're a relatively new Christian. You want to just like give me a 30-second faith synopsis.
Yeah, right? I'll give you my 19-minute testimony right now.
19-second testimony.
No. So I became a Christian when I was 24-ish years old. I kind of met a mentor at a job that I was working at in Atlanta. He kind of described Christianity as a relationship for the first time to me. Yeah. And from there challenged me in prayer to just invite God into my life and see if he'd show up. And he has done nothing short of show up in a way that I couldn't deny him. And it's been about a year and a half since of just walking with him, learning from him, and just growing as I go.
And my guess is that your mentor didn't immediately take you to Numbers 16 through Numbers 18.
No.
So as you're starting to think about a relationship with God and following him, right, this can be jarring for a lot of people when they see some of the passages in the Old Testament. And a big thing that we've got to understand is that the Bible is not just a book, right? So when we think about the book of Numbers, for example, it is one of 66 books, right? 40 different authors, thousands of years telling the same overarching story spread across 3 continents. So the Bible's a library. And when we take the library in context, we start to see that God is not just a God of wrath. And God is not just a God of peace, right? And when I say peace, I don't mean that he's like peace and war. I mean that peace is in he's okay with sin, right? Yeah. We have to see that God's so much bigger than this. And that's, as we explore all of Scripture, you can see this. And so going into this passage in particular, it's not that God is some petty, vindictive, right, manipulative bully, right, which some atheists can contribute those characteristics to him. But what we do see in here is that God actively hates sin. Yeah. And rebellion against him. And you've seen that, the Israelites continue to rebel. And there's so much of
creating
Egypt,
all these idols and everything that they're doing. Yeah.
So much of Egypt still trapped in there. And so Korah's sin, for example, I mean, what stood out to you about this particular passage?
I think what stood out to me was just the fact that they had this self-righteousness of this desire that I think I can relate to in some sense at like moments in my life of really wanting to be in control and wanting to be the one that's lifted highest. Yeah. And I think that's something that I can imagine God was not really thrilled with, as we can see in here. But I don't know where that keeps coming from when they've seen just how much God's shown up for them in the past. If you see like how they showed up through the way Moses was carrying them through the Red Sea. Yes. I can't sit there and think in my mind, if I had seen that I had been brought to where I had been brought to with God, why do they still continue to want to be putting themselves above him?
Yeah, and when you say above him, are you talking about above God or above Moses? Because it's also kind of both, right?
It's kind of both, yeah. But in this passage in particular, they're like, we want to be the priests. We want like you. We don't think you've been doing what you've promised to do. We haven't gotten to the promised land. Yes. So let's give us a crack at it.
Yes, that's a great point. I think that Korah in particular, where he's really struggles, right, is that he looks at Moses and Aaron and says, well, yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Like I could be that. What do you guys have that's so special? Which again, you said it's kind of mind blowing because he's seen Moses and Aaron lead them for years, and we have to see like Korah is probably a pretty influential person. Yeah. Right? Like he's listed in a genealogy in here. He's also rallies 250 people. Yeah. So, and from various tribes. I mean, and so this is the idea that he's stirring up like, hey, we could have the same level of power. Right. And there's some dangerous warnings that we can see here, even in a church. I mean, think about maybe some churches that you've heard of, or maybe some listeners out there have been part of like a church split. Or a church that's been fractured by insecure leadership, or leaders that are trying to one up or gang up on each other or manipulate or talk behind each other's backs and rally a bunch of people and a bunch of dissension. And that's what we're seeing. Sin. We're seeing dissension in the camp and a rallying against God's appointed leaders. Yeah. And so Moses says, okay, like you guys want to do this? Let's have a little showdown. And that's what happens where God kind of just opens up the earth, swallows them up. Yeah. And you're right in the sense that when Pastor Brett talked about the golden calf passage from Stage in our Exodus series, there was this acknowledgement that God is not going to sacrifice the entire people group of his chosen people because of the rebellion of some of the individuals in the camp. And sometimes what you have to do with sin, and this is harsh, right, is you've got to cut it out of your life. Yeah. Now, the principle principle for us, of course, is not to take lives into our own hands. Right. That's not a principle that is being taught here. Yeah. But the principle is that God is able to do with life what he wants, and he's the creator and the author of life. And so therefore, like it's the clay saying to the potter, like, hey, you have no right to do this. And the potter's like, I made you. Yeah. And so when God takes the Israelites out in Exodus 32, he's keeping the camp from continually defiling themselves, pushing even deeper into sin and rebellion and losing the entire people group. Yeah. And so in one sense, you look at this and you go, there's an act of wrath, and there is towards the 250 individuals here, and then the plague that continues on in the next section. And there's also an act of mercy for the rest of the camp, for the rest of the people group. And we see those kind of two kind of scales of God's mercy and his absolute justice. Yeah. It's balanced out in the Old Testament in a really, really profound way as you continue to read it. And you understand, like, it's not just a God of wrath. There's a God of mercy here. Yeah. A God of unfailing love, of faithfulness, slow to anger, right?
So then what would you say to people that are looking around at a lot of the stuff that's going on in our world right now? A lot of the just sheer idolatry and just all this other kind of sin festering all around our country in particular. Where's God's response to that? And I know it changes, right, with Jesus. That's the whole changing act here. But how would you describe people where they go, where's the wrath and the response that we're seeing here today?
Yeah, and I don't think that necessarily, parts of the Bible, right, are descriptive, parts of the Bible are prescriptive. And so we're seeing a description of sin and God's punishment for sin. I think sometimes it's a little dangerous to just say like, well, God is punishing sin in this situation. Right. He's not punishing, because there's elements of sin that goes seemingly unpunished in Scripture. Now, of course, we know that God is going to make all things new, all things right in Revelation, in Jesus' second coming and establishment of new heavens, new earth, all of that all will be made right. But I think it's sometimes we jump to conclusions of like, well, this act, and you name your sin, right? This act is God's punishment, right? But then we also kind of wink and nod at some other sins that God also hates, right? Like there's certain sins in our culture, right, that can seem much more prevalent and in your face than they used to. Yeah. Also, there's a lot of lying that happens. And there's a lot of using God's name in vain. There's a lot of idolatry that we have in the West, right, that is continuing to grow. And I think there is there's punishment that comes out of that. Some of it we see, some of it we don't. There's also so much mercy, and probably, I know, far more mercy, and God holding that hand back than we even see. And so, I think that the more I've read in the Old Testament, because these passages used to be really troubling for me too. So what you were acknowledging, I think, is probably what a lot of our listeners feel.
And that's why I asked that question, is because when you read it for the first time, the sheer contrast between kind of what we're experiencing now and what they experienced then is a hard thing to grasp.
Yeah. So what do you think about Aaron's staff budding? Where you're like, whoa, now there's plants on his staff, his staff has almonds on it, and in chapter 17?
To be honest, I really don't really know how to take all that in. It was a little confusing for me to read. So if you'd like to kind of just give me the rundown real quick on what that meant, because as I tried to pick it apart, I couldn't really see what God was trying to teach me in that.
Yeah, I think there's just the really quick and simple answer. I mean, that we can dive deeper in this, but I do want to talk about our passage in Mark today for a few minutes too. But the real quick and simple thing is that God is showing the Israelites, where's the life-giving leadership, right? What's the only staff that produce life? It's the leader that God said to follow. That's Aaron and Moses, right? Yeah. And so Aaron's staff produces life, and God says, follow Aaron. Not because Aaron's some special leader, but because God has said, I'm using him. Yeah. Right. And so we trust God's appointed leadership. Now, the principle for us here at Spring Hills is not like a blind trust on Pastor Brett or myself, right? Like, of course, if there's heretical teaching or abusive leadership or, anything like that in Spring Hills, that needs to be called out. It needs to be condemned, right? But there is an element to saying, okay, I'm choosing this church and I'm putting my faith in the leaders of Spring Hills, not to be perfect because we're sinners just like everyone else, right? But that we do our best to say, where's God taking this church and how do we walk forward in this? And how do we
be a positive
shepherd
part
these
of
people?
It?
And shepherd the community. And when there's a trust between the leaders that God is saying, I want you to lead this shepherd this people, and there's trust from the people, and there's unity in that. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah. And God's been really gracious to Spring Hills over the years, and a lot of other churches that have really healthy leadership and people that recognize, these are the leaders that God has placed in my life. And again, not to excuse any actions that should be excused or danced around, but just to say, I'm putting the trust in them because God has enabled them to spiritually lead this area. So
and it's that trust that you have in each other and in leadership that allows you to come, to reconcile mistakes too. Because I think if there's a lot of that conflict or you're not believing in one another, you don't have faith in one another, it can lead to a lot of those small issues becoming a lot larger than they actually are. But when you have that faith in each other, that community, that trust in one another, you can actually come together and, okay, these people are redirecting me. They're showing me where I'm wrong. I want to listen to them because I trust them.
Yeah, and Pastor Brett is my pastor, right? He is my spiritual leader that I've put under the authority of him. And that's beautiful. And not just because his walking stick produces walnuts on the end of it. It does, though. That's true.
I've seen it.
All right. Now, let's go ahead and move to the New Testament passage today in Mark. Now, what a contrast, what a contrast in passages, right? We have Korah's rebellion, and then we're jumping into the resurrection of Jesus in Mark chapter 16.
What a jump.
One of the accounts of the resurrection, right? We've got the gospel accounts, and you can see some differences, some similarities in them. Anything that stood out to you, Vaughn, in this passage or thoughts that you had, questions that you had, things you were pondering?
Yeah, the first question I had is just the significance of Mary Magdalene being the first woman to see him. Yeah. Because one of the notes that I have in my Bible, my study Bible, was showing me that in Luke 8, I believe, she was actually healed of 7 demons. I think of Jesus himself earlier on. I was wondering if that had any significance to her having the belief in him being resurrected when even the 11 didn't have belief. It was said that they had unbelief.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, why do you think, that the authors put, women at the tomb, right? Mm-hmm. So the women were the first to see Jesus, right? Mary is the very first one here. And besides, the account in Luke, and there's parts of that account I would have to look up in context. I don't have it in front of me right now, right? But with Mary being someone who was not a highly valued member of society, and a lot of it is because she's a woman, and one of the, early, like the Talmud, which is kind of like the Jewish book of like how to live, right? And like cultural guidelines, right? It was around the same time period as the Gospels were written. Yeah. It said lines like this: do not permit a testimony of a woman to be admitted in court because her testimony is the same as that of a robber or a thief. Whoa. Right. And so when we see the Gospels and they talk about women being the first at the tomb, right? What does that illustrate to us, about this?
Well, the first thing it illustrates is the truth behind what is being shared here, because you wouldn't be putting women as the first ones to share it unless it was truth, because who's going to believe that for the sake of believing it?
Absolutely. To me, the fact that women were the first at the tomb is one of the strongest piece of evidence for the resurrection. Now, there's lots of that. We don't have time to dive into all that today, of course, but what a cool piece of evidence that Jesus really was who he said he was. Because why would the disciples make something up? You're exactly right. They knew the Talmud, and they would know that them writing this would get laughed at unless it's true.
Right.
And if it's true, then we say what's true. And so, I do think there's some significance, of course, to Mary being one of the first at the tomb. I do think that there is, that it's God illustrating and choosing people that tend to get overlooked in culture to like that she's really the first real evangelist, if you will, of the gospel, right? Besides Jesus himself, of course, but she's the first evangelist of the resurrected Jesus. She's the one telling everyone the good news that Jesus is alive. I mean, how incredible is that?
It's part of like what flips it on its head too, is I think prior to this, a lot of it's like, how holy can I be? How up high in society can I be? How well looked at can I be? And this kind of flips it on its head, where it's like some of the most important people in the Bible are the people that are at the lowest, just like Jesus humbled himself. He's showing that it's not about your status is where you are in heaven.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Absolutely. Anything else that was like that you saw as a little bit, different than you read before, or other questions that you'd had?
I think one of the things that stuck out to me when I first was trying to understand what my faith was, I think I got very confused because I was looking all over the Bible. I was trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing, how I was supposed to be changing, am I supposed to be going to this church or that church, and there's so many confusing things. And the beauty of it was, if I look back to like the first couple of weeks and the first conversations I had about Jesus and about Christianity, people would say, ignore all of that and just focus, just read John and just know that Jesus died for you and resurrected. And it was that simple, but I never took it that simple. And it confused me for a long time because I was looking for all these answers other places, and it wasn't until I let all that noise kind of fall away and just took a moment to recognize just what the resurrection symbolized for what it did for me. That's what unlocked so much more understanding. That's when I truly felt being saved for the first time, was when I revered that and I loved him for that. And I think rereading this kind of sparked some of that back up in me. Is like, I wish, looking back, it was the perfect timing that he revealed everything for me. But if I had just understood what the resurrection truly meant for me, that's where that's where it would have started for my walk with God.
Yeah, isn't it cool that we took a look at the Numbers passage, which is God condemning and destroying sin, rebellion, hating sin, punishing sin, a holy, righteous, wrathful God, and then showing there's a staff, and that staff, there's where the new life springing from this piece of dead wood, right? And then we see the resurrection, that Jesus, who dies, he's buried, and him dying is him, sacrificing for the sins of the world, and then giving us redemption through that, and then being raised again, proving he can conquer death, giving us new life, right? Because we were dead. We're like a staff that can't blossom, a staff that can't bud, and we deserve to be swallowed up by the earth in Numbers. I think about my own rebellion. I know that if you think about the rebellion in your life, we go,
there's a lot of it there.
I think I've probably done some worse things than, wished I was in a different position of leadership or whatever,
Absolutely.
And I think about what I deserve and how much God has saved me from. And then out of that, choosing to believe and then walk in that. So as we'll close with this verse here, verse 16, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned, right? Yeah. Look at that verse and we know, well, God he still cannot be around sinful rebellion. And so we have the choice to come to him, to believe, and then to be saved. Did you find that interesting? It says believes and is baptized. Was that something you wondered, or like?
It was something when I first read this passage in Mark. I think it was about 8 or 9 months ago. It was probably when I first went through it. It was very confusing. My understanding of it now, and tell me if I'm wrong here, is that when it says baptized, because Jesus is the water of life, it's almost as if the belief in him is like in a sense, because I know when we have baptisms here at Spring Hills, we even say on stage, this isn't what saves you, but it is what shows people that you're making a choice to be walking with God. So is that kind of talking about how Jesus is the water, or how would you kind of describe the difference there?
Yeah, so the emphasis here in the Greek is on believes. So it's a little bit confusing when you look at this verse, and because it looks like believes and baptized together. But the emphasis here is believes, right? And the is baptized is routinely shown in the New Testament that basically believe and get dunked. You know, I think my vote for our next Spring Hills baptism t-shirts is just believe and get dunked.
I like it.
You know, I think we should make that happen.
Yeah.
We can start a campaign. Because ultimately in the New Testament, that's what it is. It's like you believe, and then like there's a passage in Acts where Philip's there with an Ethiopian, and the Ethiopian looks down. He's like, "There's some water. I understand the gospel. Why not baptize me right now?" And I think sometimes in our culture we've turned baptism into something. It's still very important. Like, don't get me wrong, but we turn it into like this separate event, and it's not a separate event. It's like, come to Christ. You should get baptized the next step.
It's our response to it, and it's like we have a response. It's like a walk goes two ways with our walk with Jesus. It's not just him doing everything, and we can just sit back and do what we want. So it's almost that same correlation of we have a response to show that we love him as much as he loves us.
Yeah, you know, I've had this conversation with people where I just go like, why won't you get baptized? You know, and they're like, I believe, but I'm not quite ready for that next step. And really the Bible always teaches it's the same step.
Yeah.
So I would just encourage our listeners out there that if you have placed your faith in Jesus Christ, let's get baptized.
Let's get baptized.
Believe and get dunked, man. Like it would be our honor and privilege to baptize you at Spring Hills if this is your church home. And if this is not your church home and you're listening from wherever else online, man, I would just encourage you to talk to your pastors at your church and take that next step, right? Because it really is the same step. Believe and get dunked. Yep. I think that's a good way to finish, Vaughn.
Yep, 100%.
Man, thank you so much for joining me. This has been so much fun
inviting me.
you.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and to all our listeners out there, keep going in the year in the Word. I know that that's a lot. We're still working through it together. What a joy it has been to study the Word with you and to continue to walk alongside you. So,
absolutely.
Thanks. All right, Vaughn, thanks for being here. Thanks, listeners. Bye.
Bye.